There is a cat on the internet that does not want to be touched. This is not metaphorical. Somewhere, right now, there is a video of a cat that has communicated its preferences on the subject of being touched with the clarity that only cats can achieve. Flattened ears, slightly dilated pupils, a tail that is doing the specific thing that tails do when the situation is approximately 3 seconds from going very wrong. And the human filming this video, who can see all of these signals, who presumably understands on some level what these signals mean, is still moving their hand toward the cat. Because they cannot help it. This is the thing about humans and the compulsion to touch animals. It is not rational. It does not respond to evidence. The evidence that the animal does not want to be touched is right there, legible and clear, and the hand keeps moving anyway. Because something inside the human brain has decided, at a level that conscious reasoning does not fully govern, that contact with this creature is something that needs to happen. You know this feeling. You have felt it looking at a dog across a room. You have felt it seeing a cat asleep on a chair. You have felt it, and here is where it gets philosophically interesting, in contexts that are genuinely dangerous. The person who reaches toward the horse that is clearly anxious. The person who crouches down towards the fox that is probably not as tame as its current stillness suggests. The tourist who extends a hand toward the wild animal that every guide has just finished explaining is not to be approached. The compulsion to touch is not learned behavior. It is not a cultural preference that varies across human societies. It is a universal, cross-cultural, apparently irresistible feature of human behavior toward animals. And the question of where it comes from, what evolutionary history produced it, what it was doing in the ancient world where it developed, and what it tells us about the specific relationship between our species and the rest of the animal world is one of the most interesting questions you can ask about what it means to be human. Let's start with the neuroscience, because the specific mechanisms involved in the human impulse to touch animals are not vague or poorly understood. They are specific, measurable, and genuinely fascinating. Touch activates the somatosensory cortex, the region of the brain's surface that processes tactile information from the skin. But the specific experience of touching soft, warm, living things involves additional processing in circuits that are associated with reward and social bonding. The specific texture of animal fur, particularly the specific softness of dense, fine, short fur, activates a subclass of sensory nerve endings called C-tactile afferents, which are distinct from the nerve endings that process other touch sensations. C-tactile afferents are specifically tuned to the specific velocity and pressure of gentle stroking movements, and they project to brain regions involved in social affiliation and reward processing rather than to the primary somatosensory cortex that handles discriminative touch. These nerve endings are the same ones involved in human-to-human gentle touch, in the experience of being stroked or held by another person. They are the neural substrate of grooming touch, of comfort touch, of the specific physical experience of being in safe, affiliative contact with another individual. When you stroke an animal, the neural pathway activated is the same pathway activated by human grooming touch. The brain is reading safe affiliative contact with a social partner, regardless of whether the partner is human or animal. The neurochemical consequences follow from this neural pathway activation. Stroking an animal, or being stroked by an animal, in the sense of being in physical contact while the animal moves against you, produces measurable reductions in cortisol, measurable increases in oxytocin, and measurable decreases in heart rate and blood pressure. These are the same physiological markers of social bonding that human physical affection produces. The body is responding to animal contact as if it were social contact, because the neural pathway it is activating is the social contact pathway. This is not a quirk or a misfire. It is a highly conserved biological system responding to a category of stimulus that falls within its evolutionary design. Parameters. Let's talk about what that evolutionary design was for, because understanding why these neural systems exist requires going back to the context in which they evolved. The C-tactile afferent system and the oxytocin-mediated social bonding system that grooming touch activates did not evolve for human-animal interaction. They evolved for primate social grooming, the specific behavior in which members of a social group manually remove parasites, debris, and matted material from each other's fur. Spending significant time in close physical contact, running fingers through each other's hair with the specific gentle stroking motion that activates these neural systems. Social grooming in primates is not primarily about hygiene. It is primarily about social bonding. The time primates spend grooming each other, which in some species accounts for significant portions of the waking day, produces the oxytocin-mediated social bonds that hold primate groups together. Grooming partners are alliance partners. Grooming time is social investment, the physical act of running fingers through another individual's fur, over and over, at the specific pressure and velocity that C-tactile afferents are tuned to, is the primary social bonding technology of non-human primates. Humans evolved from this primate baseline. The specific neural systems for processing grooming touch and the specific neurochemical bonding systems that grooming activates are our evolutionary inheritance from millions of years of primate social grooming. We still have them. They still work. They still activate in response to the specific touch stimuli they were designed to process. And animal fur is, from the perspective of these neural systems, not distinguishable from primate fur. The same texture, the same temperature, the same specific softness that activates C-tactile afferents in social grooming. Stroking the cat on the bed activates the same pathway as the grooming exchange that our primate ancestors used to build social bonds with their allies. The impulse to pet animals is, in this framework, the ancient primate social grooming impulse encountering a fur-covered stimulus and doing what it was designed to do. Now let's talk about what this looked like in the ancient human context, because the compulsion to pet animals is not a modern phenomenon. It is ancient. And its expression in the ancient world had specific ecological and social consequences. Ancient humans encountered animals continuously, at close range, throughout every day of their lives, not in the managed, bounded way that modern humans encounter animals. Not at the zoo, not in the pet store, not in the carefully contained domestic space of a modern home. In the actual landscape, at close range, in contexts that ranged from actively hunting the animal to sharing a water source with it, to having it wander through the camp perimeter in the evening. The compulsion to touch would have been active in these encounters, not always acted upon. The social and practical intelligence of ancient humans would have modulated the impulse in contexts where acting on it was obviously dangerous or counterproductive. You do not pet the cave lion. This is a rule that did not require a lengthy cultural elaboration to establish. But in the context where the impulse could be acted on safely, the injured animal that could not flee, the very young animal that had not yet developed full flight responses, the habituated camp follower animal that had reduced its human wariness to a point where approach was possible, ancient humans would have reached out. And the consequences of that reaching would have been significant. The young wolf that an ancient human touched and was not bitten by was a young wolf whose flight distance from humans was being further reduced by the specific experience of non-harmful human contact. The habituation effects of repeated gentle human touch on young animals during their critical developmental periods are profound and lasting. They are, in fact, the specific mechanism through which the behavioral selection for reduced human wariness in dog ancestors most likely worked. Ancient humans petting wolves was not just an irresistible impulse. It was a taming process. The compulsion to touch was functionally a domestication technology operating through the neural architecture of primate social grooming. Let's talk about what animals were doing on their end of these interactions, because the ancient human petting impulse did not operate in a vacuum. It operated in the context of animal social behaviors that overlapped with it in specific ways. Many mammalian species have their own versions of social touch, behaviors in which physical contact between individuals serves social bonding functions. Allogrooming in primates, mutual grooming in rodents, the specific nuzzling and licking behaviors that many social mammals engage in. These are all versions of the same basic social bonding technology that human grooming touch uses. They activate similar neurochemical bonding processes, produce similar oxytocin-mediated affective outcomes, and serve similar social cohesion functions within species that rely on social bonds for survival. When ancient humans touched habituated animals with the specific gentle stroking that activates C-tactile afferents, those animals were receiving stimulation that, in its physical properties, overlapped significantly with the intraspecific social grooming touch of their own species. The wolf being stroked by a human was receiving stimulation that its own nervous system processed through pathways that overlap with the pathways activated by social touch from other wolves. This is not a guarantee of positive response. Animals vary enormously in their responses to human touch, and many species that have extensive intraspecific social touch show strong avoidance of interspecific contact. But the overlap between human petting touch and intraspecific social touch in animals with well-developed social grooming systems provides a neurological basis for why specific animals, particularly the social mammals that ancient humans spent most time around, responded to human touch with the specific behavioral and physiological indicators of positive social experience. The cat that purrs when stroked, the dog that presses against the hand, the horse that lowers its head and half closes its eyes during scratching, these behaviors are the animal's social bonding system responding to touch that activates the same pathways as intraspecific social contact. The interspecies social bond that forms is not metaphorical or anthropomorphized. It has a real neurochemical basis in the convergent social touch systems of two species that happened to be spending a lot of time together. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about what the ancient compulsion to touch animals drove in the specific context of ancient human ecological relationships, because this is where the story stops being purely biological and becomes culturally and evolutionarily consequential. The animals that ancient humans most consistently wanted to touch were, predictably, the animals with the most socially rewarding tactile experiences. Dense fur, warm bodies, the specific texture and responsiveness that triggers the grooming touch neural pathway most effectively. These are, not coincidentally, the animals that eventually became the primary domesticated species. Dogs, cats, horses, cattle, sheep, goats, all of them have specific tactile properties that trigger human grooming touch responses more effectively than most other animal categories. The selection of these specific species as domestication targets was not purely rational utility calculation. Ancient humans were not sitting down and analytically assessing which animal species would be most useful for specific economic purposes. They were responding to a complex mix of considerations, and among those considerations was the specific experiential reward of touching them. The animals that felt good to touch were the animals that ancient humans spent more time with, invested more in, protected more, and eventually began managing in ways that became domestication. The ancient human who chose to spend extra time with the small herd of semi-habituated goats because touching them was neurochemically rewarding was, without planning or intention, participating in an early stage of goat domestication. The caloric and social cost of providing that extra proximity was being paid in part by the neurochemical reward of the touch experience itself. This does not reduce domestication to a story of humans petting animals until they became domestic. Domestication is complex, multiply-driven, and operated across many generations of selection. But the human touch compulsion was one of the forces operating in the early human-animal relationship, and its neurochemical reward properties made it a self-sustaining motivation for the kind of sustained animal proximity that domestication required. Let's talk about the specific phenomenon of humans wanting to touch not just familiar domesticated animals, but wild, dangerous, and otherwise clearly inappropriate animals, because this is where the universality and the irrationality of the impulse becomes most revealing. The documented tendency of humans to reach toward wild animals that are clearly dangerous, toward large predators in contexts where this is obviously inadvisable, toward animals that have given clear signals of their preference not to be touched. This is not a behavior of particularly unintelligent people. It appears to be uniformly distributed across intelligence levels and is documented in contexts involving biologists who absolutely should know better. The neural system being activated in these moments is not being modulated by the rational assessment of risk that the prefrontal cortex is presumably providing. It is operating through the older, faster, more automatic circuits that drive approach behavior toward stimuli that activate the grooming touch system. The prefrontal cortex says, "This animal is too large and too clearly irritated for touch to be advisable." The older circuit says, "Fur, touch." The hand moves. This reveals something important about the relationship between the human touch compulsion and rational risk assessment. They are not on equal footing in the competition for behavioral control. The grooming touch impulse operates through circuits that are phylogenetically older, faster, and in some contexts more behaviorally influential than the rational risk assessment systems that we generally like to think of as governing our behavior. In the ancient context, this balance between impulse and rational assessment was not necessarily maladaptive. The impulse to approach and touch animals that were not displaying immediate threat behaviors had, as we have established, real adaptive consequences in terms of habituating animals to human proximity and developing the interspecies relationships that drove domestication. The occasional negative outcome of a touch attempt that went wrong was the cost of a strategy that, over thousands of generations of repeated attempts with varying outcomes, was on balance productively advancing the human-animal relationship. Let's talk about babies, because the human response to baby animals specifically is a distinct phenomenon that overlaps with, but goes beyond the general touch compulsion. The specific neural response to baby animals, the cute response, triggered by the specific features that characterize young mammals, the large eyes relative to face size, the rounded features, the soft and disproportionate body proportions, the specific vocalizations of young animals, is well documented in neuroscience. It activates the brain's reward system, produces measurable increases in positive affect, and specifically motivates approach and caregiving behavior. This response is a product of the human caregiving system, the neural mechanisms that drive parental investment in human infants, which happen to be activated by the same visual and acoustic stimuli that characterize young animals as well as human infants. Baby animals trigger the human caregiving system because they share the specific stimulus features that human infants have. The features that baby animals and human babies share are a consequence of convergent developmental biology, not of any evolutionary design connecting the two. But the consequences of this accidental overlap are significant. Ancient humans encountering young animals, the young of prey species, the young of large predators encountered in situations where the parents were absent, the young of the semi-habituated camp followers whose proximity was already reducing their wariness of humans, experienced the specific motivational cascade that the cute response produces: approach, touch, and if the situation permitted, caregiving. The ancient humans who picked up orphaned or vulnerable young animals, driven by exactly this caregiving response, were the specific individuals most likely to initiate the sustained human-animal contact that produced domestication. The fawn in the camp, the wolf puppy that was too young to flee, the young goat whose mother had been killed in a hunt, these encounters, repeated across thousands of years and countless communities, were the specific events that began the domestication trajectories of the species that now share our homes and farms. The cute response is not a modern frivolity. In the ancient world, it was a domestication engine. Let's talk about what all of this tells us about the specific nature of human relationships with the non-human world, because this is the philosophical dimension of the petting question that I find most compelling. The human compulsion to touch animals reflects something about how our species is specifically positioned relative to the rest of the living world. We are not simply predators who happen to also keep pets. We are a species with a specific neural architecture, inherited from our primate grooming heritage, elaborated through millions of years of ecological engagement with the animal world, that makes us specifically inclined to seek social contact with living things beyond our own species. No other species does this consistently and universally. Wolves do not seek grooming contact with prey species. Lions do not reach towards the zebras they are not currently hunting. The cross-species social reaching that characterizes human behavior toward animals is distinctively human in its universality, its automaticity, and its resistance to rational override. It is, in this sense, one of the most specifically human things we do. Not tool use. Many animals use tools. Not language. Many animals communicate. Not social organization. Many animals have complex social structures. The specific, universal, irresistible impulse to reach out and touch the living world around us. That's ours. It is in the ancient record of every culture that has ever been studied. It is in the evolutionary record of every domestication event. It is in the neurological record of a species whose touch systems were designed for social grooming and have never stopped reaching for something to groom. Here is the full picture. Ancient humans reaching toward animals they should not have been touching were not being irrational. They were being what millions of years of primate evolution had made them. Creatures with a neural system specifically designed to seek social contact through touch, encountering a world full of fur-covered social stimuli, and doing what that system was built to do. The consequences of that reaching shaped the world. The animals that survived the reaching without harm became more habituated. The most consistently reached toward were the ones that eventually became domestic. The specific experience of grooming touch extended across species boundaries by a neural architecture that did not discriminate between human and animal fur, produced the first interspecies social bonds that eventually became the dog, the cat, the horse, and every other domesticated animal that shares our world. And sitting here with an animal within reach, you will feel it. The hand moving before the rational mind fully endorses it. The specific need to make contact with the fur, the warmth, the specific living solidity of another creature. That is ancient. That is your primate grooming heritage running in your modern brain. That is millions of years of social touch evolution encountering a cat that has absolutely communicated that it does not want to be touched. Your hand is moving anyway. You cannot help it. You never could. None of us ever could.